Our next panel is going to be speaking about the evolution of retail payments, something near and dear to many people's hearts in the room. I will introduce, or actually Tracy will introduce Marko and Sue. Over to you.
I'm Tracy Molino, Counsel here at Dentons, and we're going to walk through retail payments and evolution in Canada on a whirlwind. So I'm here with Sue Whitney. She's currently at Central One and not at Payments Canada. So Sue has over 20 years of experience in the payment space, largely focused on driving strategic initiatives, payments innovation, and stakeholder relationships. And I also have Marko Pavlovic, also from Payments Canada. And he has a similarly large amount of experience in the space, over 15 years, driving technology and innovation, a lot of time in the mobile space and mobile wallet space. And he's currently at Payments Canada focusing on the ISO 20022 strategy. And if you don't know what ISO is, that's okay, there's no test today. So we have a poll here before we get started. Did I hit the right button? No? Which button am I hitting? So we have a few questions. I don't need to read them for you. So you can text your response to question 1. I think we have 3. So if you imagine payment innovation, which I'm sure you spend all of your time thinking of, like we do, just some possible room for improvement in the Canadian payment system, what you think would be the most impactful for you? Oh, somebody wants. We can go back to the first question. I'll go through 3 of them and then go. Oh, here we go. This is a very favorable crowd. So we're off to a good start. Oh, pessimists just take one.
Oh, there you go.
All right. So I'm going to kick off our discussion today with you, Sue. So for those of you who don't know, Canada is currently undergoing a complex, multi-year, multi-million-dollar payment modernization project. And so I think, Sue, you're in a great position to sort of kick off this discussion and just give a brief overview of the highlights of modernization and some of the drivers that really started the project in motion.
Yeah, so back in 2015, Payments Canada went out to the marketplace and talked to all kinds of people, small businesses and large corporations, governments, people, and said, where are your pain points in payments? And what could we do to make things better? So akin to some of the questions that were in this survey. And so the marketplace came back and told Payments Canada a lot of different things about where there were pain points in payments, but 2 really bubbled to the top. And the first one was that payments need to be fast. They need to be faster. And the second thing was we need more data to travel with the payment so that you understand the context of why you're being paid. And then you can deal with it appropriately. So you know why you're getting this weird amount on an invoice that you were not expecting, for example. And so the marketplace told us that there were some needs for change. And at the same time, regulators were telling us that in the wake of the financial crisis, they were continuing to look at payment systems as areas that needed refinement as a result of that crisis, and that core payments infrastructure, it's kind of the backbone of money movement in a country, that it really has the potential to cause very negative shocks if it's not well risk managed. And so the regulators combined with the marketplace feedback kind of informed a modernization roadmap that Payments Canada is driving.
Great. And so in Canada, a lot of you probably are aware, banks are the primary members of the payment system, so they get to participate directly. Internationally, there's been a drive to broaden the inclusiveness in the system and allow alternate players or new parties to participate. So Marko, I know that you're really involved in technology and innovation. How is modernization in Canada proposing to deal with fintech technology?
Well, that's a good question because if you look at around the world, there's been around 30 or more countries that have been focusing on modernizing their payments, meaning that they want to open up to innovation and to the fintechs. One thing that we have in Canada, and this is why I think many of you responded that we are innovation leaders when it comes to payments, is that we have Interact e-Transfer that has been launched 20 years or some ago, which is, if you look at the industries or the other countries around the world, they didn't have this type of system that would enable you to move the money from one system to another. So what happens around the world is that the fintechs are now picking up in the P2P sector as well. What we have done in Canada is we built the Interact e-Transfer and we started the adoption, but then we kind of stopped that innovation process. So what the real-time payments right now and the payments modernization will enable is that fintech will not only be able to leverage Interact e-Transfer, but also the real-time payments platform, which will enable different type of opportunities for the fintech. Now, what are those opportunities? If you think about just movement of large amounts of money from one bank account to another with the data along with the payment, this will create a whole new array of opportunities for the fintechs. Real-time rail will also open up in the staged phased approach its access to the fintechs. So that means that, with the initiative of the real-time rail, the government said we need to open up this innovation not only to the financial institutions, but also to the paytech and fintechs. So the real-time rail will create a lot of opportunities, will create a lot of different business models, because the fintech, in order to access the real-time rail system, they will need to have the access to the system, which are for the day one intended to be for the financial institutions. So there's going to be opportunity for business partnerships between the fintechs and the banks or the other financial institutions that will allow the paytechs, fintechs to access the system.
So we're driving towards more openness eventually, but we won't start off that way. But I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned a few times and ask Sue to expand on it. Just because I know this isn't really a payments event. So you talked a few times about the real-time rail. And so do you want to just explain a little bit more for people what the real-time rail is, how it differs from e-transfer, and sort of what the goal of it is?
Yeah, so instant payments is kind of a thing around the world. And a lot of countries, other than Canada, have implemented these very fast rails that allow you to send payments, like a push payment, that's final, irrevocable, and instant. And when you think about how a lot of money moves today, you don't actually know the money's there. You don't actually know the transaction's finished at the time. And so this payment method has been designed and is in wide use now around the world. UK is a fantastic example of somebody who's implemented this now for more than 10 years. Their faster payment system allows you to do instant and final payments up to £250,000, and it's a done deal. And can you imagine how many business problems could be solved if you could complete the transaction that finally and instantly? So that's the value proposition. We need one of those. Interact e-Transfer clearly isn't operating at that level today. There's nothing to say it can't move there, but what Payments Canada is doing is kind of setting the bar here to say we need to be globally competitive and have that kind of speed. So that's really what it's for.
And I think it's interesting if you talk to people who are casual users of the payment system. I think a lot of people probably think that payments are actually quite instant. So I think our impression is that, I tap my card, I walk away, I have my groceries, and my payment is done, and I never have to think about it again. And you're explaining the reality that behind the scenes, there are thousands of moving parts involved in actually shuttling that money from your bank account to your merchant's bank account. And so that idea of that single credit transfer, that push payment where you're actually pushing money to the merchant, that money would actually belonged to the merchant, that transaction would be finished and everybody would walk away and nothing would happen in the background. Is that really what you're driving
Yeah,
at?
and if you think about it from a risk point of view, like this is where the regulators get all excited, right? Is today there is a lot of smoke and mirrors around that money movement. Most people don't care or know. The reality is the financial institutions are actually bearing that risk overnight. For example, when your debit or credit card payment hasn't actually moved. And when you think about that, if you had a financial institution fail or a run on a financial institution and all those payments actually had to get unwound overnight, that's a risk that regulators didn't want to tolerate in a post-financial crisis world. And so this notion of actually having that money finally reach its destination instantly from a risk point of view is an awesome asset. And from a value proposition view for us, it's great. And it gets even more exciting, to Marko's point, when you start to provide that capability of instant money movement to people other than the traditional financial institutions. So it's the combination of those three pieces together that's really going to drive the change.
And so let's talk a little bit, Marko, about that instant payment and the information. So I know that you're focused a lot today on ISO 20022, which is an international payment standard. It allows for more data-rich payments, but how do you see that playing into this project? Is it part of the real-time rail? Is it bigger than the real-time rail? Where does it fit into this whole discussion?
ISO 20022 is the backbone of the real-time payments. If you look at since 2014, all of the real-time payment systems have been adopting the ISO 20022 as a payment standard. The reason why is because it will enable different type of opportunities, and we are talking about if you think about all the scenarios where you have the manual reconciliation in the treasury management operations, when we talk about the cost savings that will take, reduction of the checks, all the cash flow predictability. This cannot be done efficiently today because the payment process and the whole treasury management AR, AP processes are split. So where the opportunity, where we see that the industry will go is that automatic reconciliation, elimination of a need to manually reconcile, to automatically send the invoice from one side to another. So this is what the ISO 20022 will bring, and we are looking forward to the fintechs, not only fintechs, but the whole ecosystem. You asked me what it will take. It will take the whole ecosystem to work together, because if you think about today, corporates are dealing with the ERPs, they're dealing with the banks, same thing with the fintech. So it will take, and I think the previous speaker said, it will take the whole ecosystem to get together in order to adopt the ISO 20022, which will be the crucial backbone of the modernization.
And so who do you see driving that change first? Do you have to have the financial institutions drive it, or can the fintech sort of movement really drive that forward? What do you think is the key to getting some successful adoption? I think that's a hard question.
No, it's a great question. Actually, somebody would think that you start from the financial institution, but it's actually the other way around. If you look at the market adoption curve and you're looking for those innovators and the early adopters, it's really those paytechs and the fintechs that are into B2B, in the cash management, especially personal finance management, loans and these type of services that will drive the banks to move and adopt. Same thing goes for the corporates. If you go to the corporates, and this is what we are doing right now, we are talking with the insurers, with the telcos, and if we explain that ROI is certain percentage, then they have a business case to push their ERP partners. They have a business case to go through their banking partners and say, look, this is coming. It's happening around the world. So cross-border capabilities is very important. Let's work together. So we see the adoption will strive from the other side. And then financial institutions will hopefully then get onto the board.
Can I give you a slightly different answer to that?
Yeah.
So I recently left Payments Canada to move to work in the credit union space. And what are credit unions famous for? They're famous for providing value to small business. And let's face it, the most underserved segment of our economy for everything is small business. And so this notion of data traveling with payments in a small business context is huge, because today it's all about cash flow management, and it's all about understanding how your business is actually operating, because you don't want to spend time on that. You need somebody to help you do that. So picture a world where Intuit or FreshBooks, that offers accounting packages today for small businesses, partners with credit unions who love small business, and the data that comes in with a payment in that ISO 20022 message, but all that story about the payment comes in and all of a sudden gets pre-populated into your accounting package from Intuit, and Mr. Small Business now has a better handle on how he's running his business. He knows who he's got to pay and when, and he's got this rich story that today is probably sitting in a shoebox with a bunch of crumpled paper. And so that, it's not glamorous. We're not rewriting the back offices of large corporate Canada, but every segment of Canada doesn't think about payments at all. But when you think about your friction points and you think about how data and speed can change it, it's those kinds of meaningful changes. And the way to make those things happen is about outreach. It's about partnership. So in the credit union space, a big part of what we're thinking about doing is actually building a marketplace. So think of it as a platform with a bunch of stalls, and fintechs come and knock on the door of Central One and say, I want to offer solutions that are valuable to your credit union customers. And so we'd proactively be facilitating the interaction of the fintech space with the credit unions and giving people some scale for how to reach what is otherwise a pretty distributed credit union marketplace.
And so you had a really interesting comment. So for our panel right before the break, we were talking about Verified Me, and Sue turned to me and she said, and credit unions don't participate. And so it just got me thinking, how do you ensure at Central One that the credit union movement does get some representation and a voice in the changes? How do you make sure that you don't fall behind through all of this modernization?
Well, I guess that's what I'm going to be doing.
Sue just started on Monday, so that might be an unfair question.
So give me till week 2. But so this is the sea change opportunity. This is actually a real moment around driving some innovation and competition in financial services. And the work that Payments Canada is doing is creating that platform for allowing new entrants and smaller players and disruptors to actually come in and drive some change. And so I don't know how to make sure it happens, but there's a team of us in the credit union space who are very committed to reminding people that there are other ways to do financial services. And we will be at the forefront of the changes from Payments Canada, of changes around open banking, to try and expand people's perceptions of how they can bank.
And I think for credit unions, it's a particularly acute issue because they don't actually participate directly in the system themselves today. So they do definitely rely on an umbrella organization like Central One to provide them that voice. Yeah.
And there are some very large credit unions in Canada. Like if you go west, if you look at every corner, they're credit unions. They're not banks on every street corner. And so there's some very big players, and then there's some very, very small players. So you're right. I think the credit union movement will stratify as we go forward, because some will want to do things more by themselves, and some will very much look to central processors to help them keep up with the pace of change.
And so, Marko, I think, is this your first kind of time outside of the private sector and into, yeah. So Payments Canada really sits at the center. I think we also talked about herding cats in the last presentation. So Payments Canada has a mandate to do several things, but one of them is to take into account the interests of the payment system users, but they're also funded by their membership, which is composed of financial institutions. So there's some inherent tensions at play in the payment space from the beginning. So what have you found the most challenging about this project so far that you can tell us?
Yeah, without getting fired. I think the biggest challenge is if I would just try to put it in a simple example is, if 20 people hold hands together and try to go into a direction that the guy in the middle talks and says, we're going to go in this direction, and then one guy on the other side and the other guy says, no, let's go there, let's go over there. So it kind of feels like that, walking at the same time with 20 people and trying to figure out where you're going to go. But what we are trying to do is find the right balance. We have been given a great mandate, which is to kind of open up the system and ignite the innovation, but then keep in mind also that we need to take care of our members. So it's all about the innovation, but in a very constructive, very guided way. So we are trying to find the balance. My job has been, reaching out to the fintechs and telling them, look, you got to reach out to the banks, you got to partner with them. You can't go one versus another because it's an ecosystem play. And same thing for the banks as well. So it's really just, again, the previous speaker made a good point. It's everybody needs to work together if we want Canada and Canadians to get the best out of it.
And so your role was really heavily involved in stakeholder engagement at Payments Canada. So what did you find was the biggest challenge in moving ideas forward?
So fundamentally, financial institutions and payments implicitly involves competitors, and competitors who want to eat each other's lunch all the time. And that's the fintechs want a bigger piece of the pie, and the bankers want to afford them off, and so on. But the conversation about core infrastructure change, what you actually have to do is get alignment about the areas where you don't need to compete. And that's really hard. So, for example, are there elements of Interac e-transfer that could become shared and widely available? Well, if you're an owner of that infrastructure, you're going to say, well, hang on, I put a lot of money into that thing and I've invested and it's pretty awesome and I don't want to just give it away. But regulators are saying, well, we want to make sure we have a widely available real-time payment system that is, top notch in security and so on. And so what that fundamentally is huge tension about what is core utility in a marketplace for payments and what is the competitive space, and driving alignment for where the border is between plain vanilla and competitive is really hard.
Yeah, and I've always found it interesting in this space because, each financial institution itself is so big, and even getting alignment internally, I think, on issues like payments and infrastructure can be quite challenging because different parts of a financial institution might have different strategic priorities, and those might not be in payment modernization for the quarter. And I think, too, having worked at Payments Canada as well, I think it's always challenging from a strategic perspective because financial institutions plan so far ahead. And the modernization project, while it's trying to modernize, tends to have a hard time keeping up. So I've always found it a bit tough to be strategically planning for a year when financial institutions have locked in their budgets, 18 months in the future.
It's an amazing point because our financial institutions need to be celebrated in a lot of ways. They are world leaders in many things. I think most Canadians who work inside a bank, though, the first thing they would say is, man, my infrastructure is siloed and System A can't talk to System C. And so when Payments Canada innocently puts forward this roadmap to say, let's modernize, under the covers, financial institutions are looking at a sea change of infrastructure investment to get rid of some of those silos and old systems held together with Band-Aids and binder twine. What's actually happening is a revolution of infrastructure change within the financial institutions to be able to cope with this central change. So all those fun things that a bank might want to be doing today to innovate or do something cool on mobile app or drive the new model and design of the branch, well, all the money that might be going into customer-facing sexy stuff is now being spent by banks to keep up with this darn modernization roadmap. So it's like a resource allocation that is pretty under the covers, not very sexy, but will ultimately yield enormous benefits because financial institutions will be flexible and able to do things that today it's just Herculean for them to try and do.
And so, Marko, you left the private sector to come to Payments Canada. So,
how long are you going to stay? No.
Well, I was going to ask you, what, obviously something drew you to the project. So, what drew you to working on the modernization project? It's a really challenging project. And what excites you the most about working on it?
I left, RBC Innovation, which was really innovative place to work. But this type of initiative is once in a career opportunity where you sit in the middle of the whole innovation hurricane, as we like to say, and then you go and I go back and I talk to my previous team and I tell them these are the opportunities. So I think it's just phenomenal that Canada is at this stage trying to create something that's going to be not only beneficial for the banks and the paytechs, fintechs, but it's going to change the way we do financial transactions, the way we do innovations in Canada. So what really drew me is that opportunity for Canada to take to the next level. And I think it's Payments Canada is amazing place to be because it's in the center of building that highway, regulating and creating the opportunities. We talk to the banks as well, and especially innovation teams, and they are seeing it, and they are becoming our early ambassadors, driving the innovation with the payments modernization.
And so, Sue, I'll ask you before we open up for any questions, the same reason. You've been in payments for 20 years. I feel like it's an area that sort of sticks to you. You can't escape once you start.
It's true.
But what do you think is the most exciting innovation coming up? What do you think we're just about to get to, if anything, in the space?
Hopefully, we can't even imagine what we're just about to get to. I do actually believe that with the modernization of core infrastructure, things that we think are normal. So who says an Uber driver who drove for 3 hours today shouldn't get paid today and have it done? How do we not start thinking about where our economy's going to go and how our labor force is going to change and how our needs are going to change with everything else happening in technology? And until now, payments hasn't really been part of that because of all this legacy overhang. Now payments can be right in the middle of it. And I can't even imagine the awesome things that can happen. The thing I am most excited about is that ability to partner, the ability to have nimbleness that's enough. And, you get your risk management team focused on the right stuff, and then you can actually build partnerships that are viable and robust that you couldn't do before all of this.
Great. So we have a couple minutes. If anybody has questions for us, feel free.
Thanks. Has anyone heard of the PSD2?
Yeah.
Okay. So just for the audience, it's the EU regulation on payments service providers. What would you, let's say, take from that and apply to the Canadian market? Or what do you think Canadians have to offer to Europeans or the British?
Well, to be honest with you, we are behind the things that are happening in Europe. When you look at open banking and the PSD2 GDPR, what we can do is learn. What we are doing also is, and this is the kind of message for Canadians, and especially the experts in the field, is keep up to date with what's happening. There are things that are happening in Canada that maybe most of the public is not aware, like with a couple of initiatives on the legal side, similar to PSD2, going to the PSD2. So Department of Finance launched the open banking paper, consultation paper, retail oversight payment framework is coming, changes to Canadian Payments Act. So things are happening. what we can do is learn from those, and then usually, when you look at, some markets like Europe launch and have those type of regulatory developments, what we can do is take the best and the worst out of it, and then really try to bring, the whole regulation to the next level.
What's actually so crazy is that Canadian regulators are working on a few different things where there could be phenomenal synergy. And this payments modernization, coupled with open banking, when you put the two together, it's incredibly empowering for innovation, because you could actually use modernization to go knock on the door of a customer's account, and with open banking, actually be able to go through that door and access that customer account data and then move money with it. So it's a revolution when you put the two together. We just need to get the regulators to understand that potential for alignment and make sure that we've got the right risk framework in place so that people are comfortable opening that door and letting funds move. Because it's a sea change in consumer attitudes too. We got to bring the marketplace along to want these changes and to feel comfortable with these changes. And I think looking at how other markets have built those frameworks is going to be really important for us, because if the consumer's not ready to go along for the ride, nothing will happen.
Just a final thought, like EQ Bank has published a really good paper that kind of summarizes what we have talked in 3 Venn diagrams. And this is the 5-year approach in Canadian payments, where you have digital identity, you have payments modernization and open banking coming together, and in the center of those Venn diagrams is a consent. So strongly recommend reading that paper because it really clearly identifies what we just talked about and where we are going as a nation.
We're good? We're good.
You're good.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.